Greetings YouTube. Today we're looking at a Finnish Puukko. Now before I get to opening this up and showing it off to you, I want to give you a brief story about a trip I once took to the MFA, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, Massachusetts. This is late 80s, early 90s, could be the early 90s. They were having a display of Japanese arms and armor, and one of the things they had done is they had stripped the furniture off a number of Japanese blades, and they were just showing off the blades themselves so you could see all the marks on the tangs and things like that. And one of the items in the display was a tanto blade. And it's just a blade with a little blurb next to it talking about the maker and things, because I don't read Japanese. And I was completely and utterly transfixed. I stood there for I have no idea how long I stared at that blade. It was simply the most perfect object I have ever seen with my own eyes. And my friends literally grabbed me and dragged me away because we had to go someplace else. I don't know how long I would have stood there if I'd been on my own. It, in my opinion, surpassed the definition of art. Having said that, the Puukko sitting before you on this table is quite possibly the most perfect physical object I have ever held. This was designed by a guy named, and I'm going to butcher this man's name, he's Finnish, and I apologize to any of the Finnish people in the world who ever see this. Tapio Wirkkala, which I know I'm butchering that. I cannot speak Finnish. When I try to put Finnish words through my mouth, it comes out like a speech impediment. But this particular knife here, and I mentioned the museum earlier because there is a tangential connection here, that this knife is actually in the Metropolitan Museum of Art because it is considered to be one of the finest examples of design ever produced. First thing you're going to notice is that this has a bear paw on it. And when I saw this knife at the flea market where I picked it up, I paid $25 for this. I don't think the guy who sold it to me knew what he had, because I've dealt with him before and he's not stupid, and he tends to deal on things on the mid to upper end range. So he had asked for 30, I talked him down to 25. In fact, I went back for this, and it was a gamble because I didn't know if he'd still have it, and he did. And then we have all leather, stitched. It's got a leather dangle here. It's really quite nice. Really done. And this does have a plastic liner inside for safety. Now, I can remember seeing this knife in a magazine article back in the 80s. And this was originally produced in 1961, and it was produced through 1985. I don't know where this falls in the production line timescale, so I have no idea at what point this was produced. But these are regularly going online in like the $125 to $150 range. And if this were an original 61 edition of this knife, it would be worth 10 times that. So I can't imagine this guy would have sold this to me for 25 bucks if he had known it was worth $125. I just don't think he would have. And I think the reason he did that is that the markings on the blade, and I'm going to try to do this. It's hard. It's really hard to get there. I don't know if you can see those. There you just barely. I can only read it when it's I got this very bright light and a bleak angle to really see it. And I think that's the reason that he didn't notice it, because it's very difficult to read. It is not readily apparent. When I was just looking at this at his table, which is he always sits in the shade, you couldn't read it at all. So, what makes this so wonderful? Well, the lines are perfect. There is nothing wasted. You don't need to add anything to this knife. We have brass at the guard and brass at the pommel. It's a full tang construction. There you go, you see that? And this is absolutely perfectly smooth. it is, the manufacturing and quality on this is unreal. Now, it's not perfect in the sense that this has some wear. There's a couple of nicks in this handle. This handle is black nylon, which was somewhat innovative when it was produced originally. And the designer, I believe he did that intentionally to give it a seamless, monolithic appearance. And the we have this is here. This is nice, thick here at the guard. This is flat, straight here, flat grind, secondary bevel. We have a nice taper right there. You can't even feel that engraving. It's so light. You can barely feel. It's like, am I feeling grind lines or am I feeling engraving? There's a small nick here at the edge. I will not be touching that up. I'm going to leave that the way it is, just because that kind of tells the story of this knife. And sometimes you need to let your tools and your items have their own stories. I do plan on touching this up, but I'm very hesitant. This is such a beautiful grind. I'm just terrified of hurting it. I really am. So I'm gonna have to really be careful. Maybe get some cheaper Puukkos and try to with some nice flat grinds, because I really don't want to hurt this thing. It is just so perfect. I've had this sitting next to me on my desk every day since I purchased it. It just sits right next to me, and I look at it constantly. I take it out of the sheath, I play with it, I put it back. It's so beautiful. Now this shape right here is very comfortable. It really fits your hand because of this shape. Nice round here, so this would be horrible at using for a ferrocerium rod, and I would not use the edge for that. That would be horrible in my opinion. But then again, when this was designed, ferrocerium rods weren't in wide use at all, I don't believe. People started fires with matches. But the taper, which is not perfect, this line is not actually perfectly straight, and this edge is not a complete taper. It actually straightens out here slightly. If you put it on a flat substance like this, you can see that it's not perfectly, but that's okay, because it just adds to it. It's this way because that's what the knife needs to be. And that's the genius of this designer. He designed a knife that is what it needs to be and nothing else. You don't need to add anything. You don't need to take anything away. This is it. This is the perfect Puukko. And he was a genius. And I am so fortunate to have the opportunity to have this in my collection. Not to mention, it would be a really practical fishing and hunting and camp knife. Obviously, you're going to want an axe or a saw for processing wood, but for light tasks, food prep, cutting the ropes and things and lines for taking care of your equipment in your camp and your tents and things like that, making fire sticks, feather sticks, all of those things could be done with this knife. And it just feels so good. Now, obviously, it's not a heavy duty. There's nothing here to keep your fingers off the blade other than your skill. So you're not going to be wanting to do a lot of stabbing with this, because your hand could very easily slide upward. But this is just, it's a tool. And it's a tool that presents itself to you and says, this is what I am. This is all I need to be. Do you know how to use me? It's art. It surpasses art. I know that I'm waxing poetic about a Puukko. But if you could hold this in your hands, and if you understood the history of the knife, of how these type of knives were used, why it was designed this way, the history behind it, the aesthetics and the training and the artistry it took to come up with this, you'd know what I was talking about. This thing's beautiful. And I am immensely happy that I own it. And it also makes me very happy that I got a good deal, because I am a bargain hunter. So yeah, this has been a finished Puukko by Tapio Wirkkala, whose name I am butchering. Deepest apologies to the Finnish folks of the world. And I hope that you someday get a chance to hold one of these knives, because it's definitely worth your time.